Okay, Simon and everyone, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. It has indeed been a great couple of days, and congratulations to you and your team for putting together such a marvelous program. There's no real way to kind of sum that all up in any kind of cogent way. So the best I can do really is to offer a few personal reflections on the future of Botanic Gardens and drawing on my own experience in that world and in the world of museums and universities over the past 40 years. And I hope you will forgive me too for referring to a project that I'm currently engaged in, which is running the Oak Spring Garden Foundation here in Northern Virginia, just about an hour west of Washington, D.C. We have a small staff, but a great team. And we have some wonderful, in a way, kind of unusual assets. We're not a botanic garden, but we do have a garden, a beautiful garden with some extraordinary features. Gardening is certainly part of what we do, but what we're really doing is to develop Oak Spring as a place for all kinds of activities related to plants, gardens, and landscape. And some of those activities will revolve around really this magnificent library with its collection of rare books relating to plants, gardens, and landscapes, assembled by Rachel Lambert-Mellon, which contains some really astonishing works. For example, this copy of Mattioli from the 16th century, and this spectacular botanical art of Elizabeth Blackwell. And so it's a really wonderful asset, and we're trying to find ways to kind of activate this collection and make it more and more useful. Now, obviously, the last 18 months for all of us have been a very strange time, and all of us in our institutions have had to respond in very different ways. Here at Oak Spring, many of our in-person programs were canceled, so we spent some time doing some much needed capital projects like renovating this barn, but we've also spent time on our landscape where we're seeking to try to transform a landscape that's basically dominated by European pasture grasses to one that's richer in the native Virginia flora. And like many others, we've been doing much more online. One of my favorites from this kind of strange time that we've lived through is this brilliant piece by Henry Nolte from Edinburgh, who during the lockdown wrote a brilliant and creative online flora of his street in Edinburgh. And what we've been doing is asking some of the artists and residents who would normally be here to submit their work online. And so we've been trying to get the word out in that way. But the moment to which we need to respond is more than just the pandemic. It's also a moment where many organizations are more focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion than they have ever been, catalyzed, of course, by the killing of George Floyd. And we're living in a moment where science and facts seem to carry much less weight than they used to. And we also need to take account of the changing demographics of our population as the Western population ages and new generations of digital natives take the place of digital pioneers. And of course, as an organization with the natural world at the heart of our missions, we must be concerned about the current and accelerating environmental crisis. The world is changing very fast, not only through climate change, but also through the rapid changes in land use as a result of urbanization and clearance for agriculture, nitrogen pollution, and many, many other factors. And we all know this, and if we take some time to reflect on the changes that we've seen with our own eyes, we know that the world is changing rapidly. That should give our mission some urgency. To give a specific example, during the pandemic, I was asked to contribute to a forthcoming book on Dumbarton Oaks. Dumbarton Oaks is an outpost of Harvard University in Georgetown in the western part of Washington, D.C. It's a home to one of the most important gardens in America, designed almost exactly a century ago by a pioneering garden and landscape designer, Beatrix Farrand. And a century ago, it would have been very difficult, I think, for Beatrix Ferran to anticipate the challenges that are faced today by those who are charged with sustaining her garden masterpiece. In 1920, the population of Washington, D.C. was about 500,000. Today, it's almost 5.4 million, with the resulting impacts on climate, hydrology, and vegetation that flow from that urbanization and appropriation of rural land. And that's a particular problem at Dumbarton Oaks with its steep topography. Recent decades are among the warmest of the past 1,500 years, and climate change has brought more frequent and more intense rainfall events. That means more runoff with higher loads of pollutants from greatly increased impermeable surfaces that have just grown over the last 100 years, which is hugely problematic on this side. Also interesting is the change in vegetation over the past century. A century ago, the only non-native plant recognized in the 1919 flora of Washington, D.C. as abundant everywhere was Japanese honeysuckle. Other non-native plants that are now widespread were not even mentioned. The number of non-native species have roughly doubled in the last century. And of course, there have also been successive waves of devastating pathogens from chestnut blight to emerald ash borer. And at the same time, credible estimates suggest that the absolute number of birds in North America has declined by almost 30%. That's 2.9 billion individual birds in the last 50 years. And that pattern, well documented in birds, is likely to be the same with plants and insects and many other species. So we should remember that the spiral to extinction often begins not with entire disappearance, but declining steady abundance. Something that's implicit in a way in the red list assessments, but rarely highlighted. This is a book we have in the library called The Wildflowers of Georgetown. And here are two species that used to grow around Dumbarton Oaks, but now no longer grow there, and once common species that existed at that time are no longer encountered in that part of Washington, D.C. So how to respond to all of this? How to seize the moment while imagining the future? Well, the four organizations that I've been associated with during my career, Field Museum, Kew, Yale, and the Oak Spring Garden Foundation, they're all different, but they've all sought to respond to changing circumstances over the last few decades in similar kinds of ways, which for me boil down to 6 simple points that I'll try to highlight in this talk and that are worth bearing in mind as we think about how to respond to a changing world and how to best position our organizations for the future. Point 1, sustaining relevance. Sustaining relevance takes many forms, but it's absolutely vital for the future of our institutions. The practical ways in which different institutions will respond will be constrained by the 3 key variables that explain a great deal about institutional behavior. That is their history, their governance, and their finances. But sustaining relevance is at the heart of rising to the moment, whether the moment is societal concern about the environment or the remedying of past racial inequalities. All organizations, from Yale or Kew with their deep complex histories, or even to the Chicago Botanic Garden, Natural History Museum here in Washington, D.C., are trying to figure out, I know, how to rise to this important social moment of the last 18 months. And we're also not immune from the need to peel back the layers of history to see what they reveal. On our own landscape, where agricultural productivity was once made possible by enslaved people, as witnessed by the change in agricultural census data from before and after the Civil War, we have much to learn about the former presence of African Americans on our landscape. So we have to make a concerted effort to monitor and sustain diversity among the awardees in our fellowship and residency programs, but we have a lot more to do and we have a long way to go. At the same time, during the pandemic, as we've seen repeatedly in times of challenge and hardship, the pandemic has reminded us how much gardens and parks and other green spaces provide relief and sanctuary and solace. Gardens and other green spaces increasingly are recognized as contributing positively to safe and healthy communities while enhancing individual mental and physical well-being. That's another part of our relevance. And gardens too have much to contribute to our understanding of climate change, as this recent review in the New Phytologist points out. But sometimes, as we try to position our organizations for increased relevance, we need some kind of programmatic refocusing. For example, at the Field Museum in the 1990s, while we were strong in research and we had great collections, we often found after we'd taken a group of potential donors on a tour, we found them asking, well, what's that all about? So what? And we wanted, the answer to that is to add relevance in some way. So we created a couple of centers that were meant to bring the scientific resources and collections of the museum to work more closely together on environmental and cultural problems. And as Sandy Boyd, the president of the Field Museum, used to say, the creation of those centers linked the Field Museum to two of the most important issues of our time: how we can live together and how we do that on a living planet. At Kew, as has already been mentioned, I was very fortunate that my predecessor, Ian Prance, had already begun the search for greater relevance by connecting the institution more robustly to environmental concerns, including most dramatically through securing the £80 million from the Millennium Commission for the creation of the Millennium Seed Bank. The goal was 25,000 species in a decade, and it was a hugely successful program, arguably the largest program of ex situ plant conservation ever undertaken, with benefits of many kinds. What it did not address, however, at the time was this issue: the loss of genetic diversity among our most important crop plants, which is nicely summarized in this recent New Phytologist Tansley review. So it was very gratifying when Kew was able to go further in terms of relevance by combining its expertise with that of the Crop Trust that Paul Smith mentioned in the previous session. And the Crop Trust is an instrument of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, and is also a key partner in the Svalbard Gene Bank. Together, Kew and the Global Crop Diversity Trust were able to secure a grant of $50 million from the Norwegian government to focus on the wild relatives of the world's most important crop plants. But in our enthusiasm, and I think Paul was hinting at this earlier on, in our enthusiasm for the rare and exotic species, we shouldn't forget the importance of the relatively few species that underpin our food system. We shouldn't ignore rice, maize, wheat, potatoes just because they're commonplace. We need to tell people about them. We need to tell their stories too. Second point, science is not enough. It's very interesting when I went to the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies that it was studies and not sciences. And that struck me as a deliberate choice. It was a deliberate choice not to be all about science, but to put people in the picture, build strengths in anthropology, sociology, environmental policy, recognizing that developing and promulgating solutions to environmental challenges and opportunities is as much about hearts and minds, not just about science. It's about trade-offs. Solutions to our environmental challenges will come not from science alone, but from understanding coupled natural and human systems. And we see this, of course, very obviously around climate change, where the science is clear enough, but real action will only be driven by political will, which in turn requires reaching the hearts and minds of the broader population. So botanic gardens have the opportunity to broaden their remit beyond science into other areas. And one trend is to reach out into the humanities through its components of languages and literature and history and law and religion and art and so on, which can help reach new audiences in new ways. So for example, we see the creation of a Humanities Institute at the New York Botanical Garden, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which is very active in running a range of programs, including increasingly programs connected to the cultures of food. A smaller but similar effort is underway between Kew and Royal Holloway College. And here at Oak Spring, we're involved in the Plant Humanities Initiative at Dumbarton Oaks, and I'd really recommend that you check out the website there, at the core of which is the creation of interactive visual narratives about the cultural history of plants, using software developed by JSTOR and powered by linked open data. They connect those narratives to available data and databases, like the ones in JSTOR or Biodiversity Heritage Library, and so on. It allows complex data sets to be visualized through networks and interactive timelines. So here are some of the examples on the plant humanities side. And these outputs can be used in a variety of ways, used in universities as didactic exemplars or as class assignments or mini projects or even mini texts. The third point, more action, less talk. I just love this quote from Teddy Roosevelt's biography. Do what you can with what you've got where you are. It's an action-oriented philosophy. And these days of seemingly endless talking shops, especially at the international level, it's important to actually do something. So for example, the Aichi Biodiversity Target 11 to protect at least 17% of the Earth's ecosystems. That's great, but how do you get it done? It will require the creation of new parks and reserves covering an area that larger than India. And an interesting question that we sometimes overlook is it's not about only determining which new areas should be protected. That's a kind of common research program with biodiversity hotspots and so on. The real question is, how are we going to get that done? How will these new areas achieve protection? And how can we do that in a socially equitable fashion? That's receiving much less attention. One of the things that grew out of the reorganizations that we did in the field at the Field Museum was to create this Office of Environmental and Conservation Programs. And the goal of that was to develop efficient creative links between the knowledge base at the museum and immediate urgent needs in conservation and education at the regional and international levels. And that started with these rapid assessment programs done in partnership with Conservation International that really emphasized urgency and the importance of making fast, good, and useful assessments rather than perfect evaluations that would take decades to complete. That led to a campaign of collaborative conservation science focused on Peru's Loreto department, one of the most biodiverse parts on our planet. So these dots represent a whole range of different biological and social inventory sites. And emerging from that, many of those individual trips were followed up with the creation of national reserves and national parks. And how did that happen? Here's the impact, considerable impact, some 5.7 million hectares additionally protected. That happened by interacting socially, not only with the sciences. So it was a way of not only understanding the biology and the habitats, but also working with the communities and other partners right from the outset with the view of getting the deal done and getting new protected areas delimited and declared. The process, in other words, has brought people into the picture. Fourth point, local action gives greater traction. All four of the organizations that I've been part of in my life have had national and international reach, but each of them, in their own way, has had to pay attention to serving their local constituents. As a generalization, local constituents provide funding, but even setting aside the finances, there's inevitably a synergistic relationship with local audiences. Whether you want it or not, costs and benefits flow both ways. And more generally, with more than half the world's population now living in urban settings, public gardens, parks, and passages of nature in cities are of disproportionate importance. At the Field Museum, serving the people of the city of Chicago and Cook County had to be a primary preoccupation, both to add relevance again, local relevance this time, and to balance a well-developed portfolio of international research activities, including conservation action, with more local action. And one vehicle was through helping create the Chicago Wilderness Initiative. Really a network of organizations, more than 100 partners, focused on managing healthy landscapes, ensuring more sustainable agriculture, prioritizing green infrastructure in planning, increasing conservation lands where that's possible, increasing access to nature as benefits for all people, and bearing in mind and taking climate action and protecting healthy water. The same principle applied at Kew. Kew must be one of the botanic gardens with, in a way, some of the greatest international reach. But one of the highest priorities that I certainly had during my time there was to get the organization also focused on plant diversity in the UK, both on the Kew landscape, for example, in the conservation area with these wonderful bluebells, but also at Wakehurst, where there were sites of special scientific interest and where conservation action could be taken to look after the species that were valuable on that site. Even at Yale, with its huge international reach, and our students came from 25 different countries, a very important effort was the effort in New Haven itself, the Urban Resources Initiative. That worked with every neighborhood in New Haven, and also with high school students and adults that had employment barriers for one reason or another, on planting trees throughout all of the neighborhoods of New Haven. And one of their recent initiatives was to create a New Haven botanical garden of healing dedicated to the victims of gun violence. And here at Oak Spring, during the pandemic, we developed our biocultural conservation farm, which is both focused on production, but also the conservation of heirloom Appalachian varieties. And we were able to donate some 20,000 pounds of produce to local food banks in 2020. Point 5, electronic outreach is not optional. We all understand that expanding electronic outreach, even though we are essentially place-based organizations, is vital to our future. And this symposium is a great example of the spectacular benefits of bringing presentations to a broader audience, and importantly, at no cost, with nothing hiding behind a paywall. We will all do more online in the future. For us, it's about activating in part that wonderful library. I'd ask you to check out Fantastic Flora. We post one of these every week. All of the illustrations are from our library. There was a new one posted today. They're freely available for download. There's about 60 of them, and we just intend to keep doing this for the foreseeable future. Ned Friedman yesterday mentioned the important landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted. It's the bicentennial of his birth next year. In conjunction with that, we've produced an online exhibit that you can either view online or you can download it. You can download the 20-odd panels and create your own local exhibit simply by printing out, whether you want to do that on a piece of A4 or whether you want to do that on a big poster, by printing out the posters which can be downloaded from the site in high resolution. And we're now trying to figure out how we're going to do a Spanish version of this. Similarly, another landscape architect, this time Humphrey Repton, we found a way to activate his wonderful drawings of landscapes, working with a computer animation firm, did it in a very gentle way, and then with Jeremy Irons following along and reading Repton's words. Again, I'd recommend you take a look at that. And at Yale, our forestry team was very concerned about the issue that was mentioned yesterday, and that is that much of the land being cleared, whether it's for rubber plantations or for agriculture, is not good land for those purposes, and so it will be abandoned sooner or later. So an important question is, how can we restore those lands in a good way with native species, encouraging biodiversity? The Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative sought to do that primarily through online teaching, supplemented with some shorter targeted field trips. And then finally, the most obvious point, individuals make a difference. Many of us have been beneficiaries of the philanthropy of Paul Mellon. who was concerned mainly about horses and art, but also did a huge amount in land conservation, including the Global Plants Initiative, which he started, and JSTOR, which was started by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And from our point of view, Mrs. Mellon was our major benefactor. Without her, the Oak Spring Garden Foundation would not exist. It's one of her legacies. And she was important not only for what she left, but also for her interaction with President Kennedy and her design of the Rose Garden at the White House. But the Mellons had great wealth and privilege, and they used it well. But equally important, I felt, were the 150 idealistic, energetic, innovative young people that graduated from the Yale School of Forestry every year in some form of environmental studies or environmental sciences, and then go off around the world to have a real on-the-ground impact. And I couldn't have been happier last week when 2 of those students were among the first ever winners of the Earthshot Prize. And back to that Peruvian example, a lot of people contributed to that work, but it would never have happened without the dedication and application of 2 key individuals, Debbie Moskowitz, a native of Brazil and a Princeton-trained ecologist, and Alika Wally, a Harvard-trained anthropologist. So I'm going to leave you with one last thing, and this is a young person who we supported through a fellowship, and I hope the video will work, who's bringing together the library and art in a contemporary way as a means of reaching out to new audiences, which is absolutely the key if we're to seize the moment and position ourselves for the future. Let's see if this 3-minute video will work. Will it work? Doesn't seem like it wants to work. Let's just see. No, well, you're going to miss that. But maybe at 7:30 on a Friday night in England or 8:30 in continental Europe, now's a good time to stop. But before I finish, I just want to thank on behalf of all of us that have participated, all of us that have listened and watched part of this symposium. We should thank Simon and Lauren and the whole Oxford Botanic Garden and Arboretum team for giving us such a wonderful, wonderful 2 days. I hope you've all enjoyed it. I certainly have. And thank you and congratulations to the Oxford Botanic Garden and Arboretum on their 400th birthday. Thank you.